He had $50 million to give away, and not a single child who deserved it. That's what Harold Whitmore wrote in his final letter. Not in anger, not in bitterness, just in the quiet, devastating clarity of a man who had watched his own blood turn into strangers wearing his last name. The day they buried him, his 3 children were already doing math at the graveside. I know, because I was there. I watched it happen. And what I'm about to tell you will make you question everything you think you know about family, loyalty, and what people are truly capable of when there's money on the table. Stay with me until the end, and drop the name of your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. My name is Daniel Whitmore, and I am the man nobody talks about in this family. Not the firstborn, not the favorite, not the one with the law degree or the corner office, or the pearls and the pressed blazer. I'm the nephew, Harold's younger brother's only son, which means I grew up in the strange, uncomfortable space of being close enough to the family to see everything, but far enough outside of it that no one ever bothered to perform for me. They forgot I was watching. That was their first mistake. Harold Whitmore, my Uncle Harold, was not a warm man by nature. He was precise, deliberate, the kind of man who shook your hand and looked you directly in the eye and made you feel, for exactly 3 seconds, like the most important person in the room. Then he moved on, and you understood that the 3 seconds were genuine, but they were also all you were getting. He grew up with nothing. I mean that literally. His childhood home in rural West Virginia didn't have insulation in the walls. He told me once that he could see his own breath from November through March, and that he wore the same 2 shirts to school for 3 years straight, alternating them every other day and hoping nobody noticed. They noticed. He knew they noticed. He went home and swore to himself that he would never, for as long as he lived, be the man who couldn't provide. And he never was. By the time I was old enough to understand what money meant, Harold had already built something remarkable. He started with a single hardware supply company in Roanoke, Virginia, the kind of unglamorous, load-bearing business that most people drive past without thinking twice. He stocked screws and brackets and industrial piping for contractors and construction crews, and he ran it with the obsessive, grinding focus of a man who remembered exactly what cold walls felt like. Then he bought a second company, then a third. He diversified into commercial real estate, into regional logistics, into a small private equity arm that acquired struggling family businesses, and turned them around with a combination of ruthlessness and surprising patience. By his early 50s, Harold Whitmore had a net worth that would have been unimaginable to the boy who wore the same 2 shirts. $50 million. Maybe more, depending on how the markets were moving. He married once, a woman named Patricia, who was gentle and musical and made the big house feel like a home, until she passed from pancreatic cancer, when the youngest child was only 14. Harold never remarried. He poured everything he had left into the businesses and into 3 children who were supposed to be his legacy. Instead, they became his greatest failure. Not at first. At first, I think he genuinely believed they were good people. Why? Let me tell you about Vanessa, Cole, and Miriam. Not the way they would describe themselves, not the carefully edited, LinkedIn-friendly versions they offered to anyone who asked. I'm going to tell you what they were actually like because I knew them, and because the truth is the only thing Harold ever asked of anyone. Vanessa was the eldest, 51 years old by the time all of this unraveled, and she carried that status like a piece of hardware installed at birth. She was tall, impeccably dressed in that careful, deliberate way that says, I have money, and I want you to know it without looking like I'm trying. She worked as a senior partner at a family law firm in Richmond, which struck me as one of the more fitting ironies I'd ever encountered. A woman who spent her professional life adjudicating other people's family disasters while creating her own. She had 2 ex-husbands and a son named Carter, who was away at boarding school in Connecticut and who called his grandmother, when Patricia was alive, more reliably than he called his own mother. Vanessa was not cruel exactly. She was cold in the particular way of people who decided early in life that vulnerability was a liability, and then spent decades constructing walls so well built that eventually they forgot there was a person inside them. Her relationship with Harold had been strained for 15 years, ever since he declined to give her a controlling stake in one of his mid-tier logistics companies and offered a minority position instead. She never forgave him for that. She told herself she had, but she hadn't. I could see it every time they were in the same room, the way she smiled at him too quickly and too wide, the way her eyes would move just for a half second to the bookshelves and the paintings and the antique furniture. cataloging, always cataloging. Cole was the middle child, 47, and where Vanessa operated with precision, Cole operated with charm. He was the kind of man who walked into a room and immediately made everyone feel like they were all old friends. He laughed easily. He remembered birthdays. He was, by all surface measurements, the most likable person in the family. He was also, I came to understand, the most dangerous. Cole had bounced through several business ventures over the years. A restaurant group that had 3 good years and 1 catastrophic fourth. A sports apparel startup that got acquired for enough money to make him temporarily insufferable, and most recently a consulting firm that seemed to exist primarily as a vehicle for him to stay busy and feel important. He was smart enough to succeed, but undisciplined enough to keep almost succeeding, which is its own kind of torment. He had a wife, Sandra, who was lovely and patient, in the way that suggested she had been quietly processing a significant amount of disappointment for a long time. They had twin daughters in middle school. Cole loved them, I believe that genuinely. But loving your children and being present for your children are 2 different things. And Cole had a weakness for chasing the next big thing that kept him perpetually half absent, even when he was physically there. Cole's grievance with Harold was more recent. 3 years prior, Harold had quietly declined to co-sign on a commercial loan Cole needed for a new venture. Something about a boutique hotel development in the Blue Ridge Mountains. Harold had done his due diligence on the numbers and decided the risk wasn't sound. Cole had nodded and said he understood, and then gone home and told Sandra that his father had deliberately sabotaged him out of favoritism toward Vanessa. He believed that. I'm not sure he was wrong too, but it wasn't the full picture. Miriam was the youngest, 43, and the one Harold had been most worried about for the longest time. Not because she was difficult. She wasn't. Not in the obvious ways. Miriam was soft-spoken and artistic. The kind of person who seemed genuinely interested in whatever you were saying and made you feel heard in a way that was either authentic or an extraordinarily effective performance. She painted. She had a modest gallery in Charlottesville that did well enough to justify calling itself a gallery. She had never married, had a long-term partner named Elliot, whom she described as uncomplicated, which I always found to be a curious thing to say about the person you chose to come home to. She was closer to Harold than either of her siblings, or at least she appeared to be, calling him regularly, visiting more often, remembering the names of his doctors and his medications and the food he liked. I had thought, for years, that Miriam was the good one. I was wrong about that. It started, as so many slow disasters do, with an announcement that seemed ordinary on its surface. The summer Harold turned 82. He gathered his children, and me, because I was family enough to be included in these things when it served the narrative, for a dinner at the estate. The house was a colonial revival on 14 acres outside Charlottesville, the kind of property that looks casual until you start calculating acreage. Patricia had loved the garden, and Harold had kept it immaculate in her memory, which I always thought was the most human thing about him. We sat around the dining room table, the long mahogany one that had hosted 30 years of Christmas dinners and Thanksgiving standoffs and birthday celebrations that were always slightly too formal. Harold sat at the head, as he always did. He'd lost weight that year, and the chair seemed slightly too large for him, though he'd never in his life have admitted to it. He waited until after the main course, the way he always did when he had something to say. Harold believed in letting people eat before delivering difficult information. He thought it was humane. In retrospect, it was also tactical. Nobody throws a scene on a full stomach if they can avoid it. I've decided to finalize the estate, he said, setting down his fork with that particular quiet precision that meant the conversation was now his. The table went still. I've been working with my attorneys for the past several months. I'm 82 years old. I've had 2 cardiac events in 3 years, and I won't pretend I'm immortal. The documents will be finalized within the calendar year, and I wanted you to hear it from me first. Vanessa said, "That's very responsible of you, Dad," in a tone of voice that managed to be both appropriate and somehow completely wrong. Cole said, is your health? And trailed off in a way that was half concern and half something else. Miriam reached across the table and put her hand on Harold's. She said, "I'm glad you told us," and her voice cracked just slightly, which may or may not have been real. Harold looked at her hand on his, and then looked up at all 3 of them with those gray eyes of his that had always seen further than people wanted to be seen. "I also wanted to say," he continued, "that I hope the 3 of you will remember when the time comes that there is more at stake than whatever numbers appear on a piece of paper. Your mother and I built a family. That is the only thing I ever built that I was truly proud of." Nobody said anything to that, and I think that was when Harold Whitmore understood, fully and without the buffer of hope, that the family he thought he'd built was already gone. Well, IV. The next 6 months were a study in what people reveal about themselves when they think they're being subtle. Vanessa flew down from Richmond twice in October alone, which was twice more than she'd visited in all of the previous year. Each time she arrived with thoughtful gifts: Harold's favorite bourbon, a first edition he'd mentioned wanting, a handmade quilt from an artisan market she'd passed through in Maryland. She was attentive and solicitous, and she suggested over 2 separate dinners that perhaps it would make the most practical sense for the estate to be administered through her firm, given her professional expertise in exactly these matters. Harold accepted the bourbon and the book and the quilt. He thanked her for the offer and said he'd think about it. He called me after the second visit and said, "Daniel, Vanessa brought me a first edition Hemingway today." "That's a nice gift," I said. "I haven't mentioned Hemingway to her in 20 years. There was a pause. "She did her homework," he said. Cole took a different approach. He started calling Harold more frequently. Long calls, easy and conversational, the kind Cole was genuinely good at. He caught Harold up on the twins, on Sandra, on a new development opportunity he was excited about. He was careful in those early weeks not to mention money at all, which was so conspicuously out of character that Harold mentioned it to me with what I can only describe as a kind of sad amusement. "Cole talked to me for 45 minutes last Tuesday," Harold said, "and didn't ask me for a single thing." "How was that?" I asked. "Terrifying," he said. The call where Cole finally circled back to the Blue Ridge Hotel project came in November. He framed it carefully, graciously, not as a request, but as a conversation. He said he'd been thinking, and he wondered if perhaps, given the estate planning, there might be a way to structure an early distribution that could allow him to move forward with the project without needing outside financing. He said it the way a man says something he's rehearsed 40 times but wants to sound spontaneous. Harold listened. Then he said, "I'll keep that in mind, son." Cole said, "Of course, no pressure, Dad. I just wanted to throw it out there." Harold said, "I know you did." And then there was Miriam. Miriam's approach was the most sophisticated, which surprised me, and then, upon reflection, didn't surprise me at all. She didn't change her behavior dramatically. There were no sudden gift offensives or suspicious phone calls. Instead, she deepened. She came to visit, and she actually stayed, sometimes for 4 or 5 days at a stretch, helping Harold with errands and attending his doctor's appointments and sitting with him in the evenings. She learned the names of his neighbors. She asked him about Patricia in a way that Harold clearly found moving. And in those quiet evenings, softly, gently, without ever seeming to press, she talked about her gallery, about how much it meant to her, and how close it was to becoming something truly sustainable, and how her one real obstacle was capital. She talked about how much she wished she had the security to really invest in it properly. She did not ask for anything directly. She was too smart for that. She let Harold ask, which he did one evening in December, when he said, "What would it take, Miriam, for the gallery? What would it actually take?" And Miriam looked at him with those soft, sincere eyes and said a number. I wasn't there for that conversation. Harold told me about it later, in January, when he called me at 11 o'clock on a Sunday night, which he had never done before. "Daniel," he said, "Uncle Harold, is everything all right?" "No," he said, "I don't think it is." V. I drove out to Charlottesville the following weekend. The estate was the same as always. The bare January garden still beautiful in its bones, the long gravel driveway, the house that had always felt slightly too large for one man. Harold met me at the door himself, which he used to do when I was a child, and which felt now like a small regression that twisted something in my chest. He looked tired. Not sick exactly, or not more sick than he'd looked in the past year, but tired in the deeper way, the way that isn't about sleep. We sat in his study, which was floor-to-ceiling books, and the old leather chairs and the smell of paper and whatever wood polish his housekeeper used, and he poured us both a measure of bourbon, and then he talked for a long time. "I've been watching them," he said, "all 3, since August." "I know," I said. He looked at me. "You saw it too." I didn't want to say anything. "No," he said. "No, you wouldn't have. You're too much like your father that way. Too careful with other people's feelings." He swirled the bourbon. "I've been trying to figure out when it changed. When they stopped coming because they wanted to see me and started coming because of this. He gestured vaguely at the room, which meant the house, which meant everything. Do you think it was always there? I asked. Even before the announcement? I think the announcement lit it up, he said. The way you turn on a light in a room and suddenly see all the things that were already there in the dark. He paused. The rivalry between Vanessa and Cole is 15 years old. I knew about that. I thought it was manageable. And Miriam? He stopped. Miriam, I said. She's been talking to a financial advisor, he said. One of her own, not one of mine. I have a friend who mentioned it. He ran across it by accident. I won't say how. She's been getting assessments done on what her share would look like under different distribution scenarios. I didn't say anything. She sat with me, Harold said, and his voice was flat in a way that was harder to hear than anger would have been. She sat with me at Patricia's grave last October. She held my hand and she cried and she told me that the family was the most important thing in the world to her. He set his glass down, while she was running distribution scenarios with a financial advisor. I didn't know what to say to that. I still don't, honestly. I want to tell you something, Daniel, Harold said, and I want you to understand that I'm telling you because you're the only person in this family I trust right now. Okay, I said. I've been working on something for the past 3 months since the dinner in August, something that none of them know about. He looked at me with those gray eyes. I'm going to need your help. It's what Harold told me that evening changed the way I understood everything that came after. He had not finalized the estate the way his children assumed he had. While they were making their moves, Vanessa with her lawyers and her first editions, Cole with his rehearsed phone calls, Miriam with her quiet, devastating sincerity, Harold had been doing something else entirely. He had been consulting with an estate attorney named George Falk, a man he'd known for 30 years, and together they had been restructuring everything. Not in secret, exactly. Everything was above board, fully legal. But Harold had been deliberately allowing his children to believe the plan was straightforward, a standard distribution, assets divided among 3 beneficiaries, while behind the scenes he was building something far more complex. The trust, Harold said, and I remember the way the firelight moved across his face when he said it. I've been setting up a family trust, not a standard one. What kind? I asked. The conditional kind, he said. And there was something in his expression, not quite a smile, not quite grief, that I couldn't entirely read. I've spent 40 years watching people make money. I know what it does to them. I know what the prospect of money does to them before they even have it. He picked up his bourbon again. My children are good people, Daniel. I need you to believe that I believe that. But good people can become unrecognizable when fear and greed get into them together. And what I've been watching this past year, he didn't finish the sentence. The trust, I prompted. The trust holds the bulk of the estate, somewhere in the range of 38–40 million, depending on valuations at the time of my passing. The remainder is distributed in standard bequests, enough that none of them are in any difficulty. But the trust. He looked at me steadily. The trust can only be released under one condition. What condition? He told me. I sat with it for a moment. Then I said, Harold, they're going to be furious. Yes, he said. They might refuse. They might, he said. That would tell me something important about them. And if they do what you're asking, if they actually, then I'll have been wrong about them, he said simply. Then it means the people I thought I raised are still in there somewhere, and I will have been glad to be wrong. He reached into the desk drawer and pulled out an envelope, old, cream-colored, slightly battered at the corners. He set it on the desk between us. This goes with my will, he said. George knows about it. When the time comes, it gets read at the same time as the legal documents. I looked at the envelope. It said, in Harold's careful, old-fashioned handwriting, for my children. What's inside? I asked. Everything, he said. Boss, sepent. I won't lie to you and tell you the next 18 months were peaceful. They weren't. Harold's health declined that spring in the slow, stubborn way of a man who refuses to fully cooperate with his own deterioration. He had 2 more cardiac episodes, both minor, both treated and managed, and a bout of pneumonia in April that frightened everyone more than we admitted. He kept working, because stopping work would have meant admitting something he wasn't prepared to admit. He attended quarterly reviews and reviewed financial reports, and had his attorneys over for long sessions that his children knew about in only the vaguest terms. The siblings visited. all three of them, more frequently than before, which under different circumstances might have been touching. Vanessa made it down from Richmond almost every other weekend through March and April. Cole brought Sandra and the girls in February, and it was a genuinely good visit. Harold loved the twins with the uncomplicated warmth he found hardest to access with his own adult children, and for a few days the house felt like itself again. Miriam was there more than anyone. I watched this. Harold asked me to be around more, which I was, telling my own employer that I had family health circumstances requiring flexibility, which was true. My wife, Louise, was patient about the weekends I spent in Charlottesville because Louise understood things like that. She came from a complicated family herself and had a kind of bone-deep empathy for family grief that I leaned on more than I ever adequately thanked her for. The dynamic between the siblings, when they were all in the house at the same time, was something I can only describe as a sustained performance of normalcy with a live wire running underneath it. One Sunday in March, I was in Harold's study going over some paperwork with him when the three of them were all in the kitchen together, and I could hear the conversation from down the hall with perfect clarity. It started normally. They were talking about Harold's spring garden plans and whether to hire a new groundskeeper, and it was all very civilized. Then Vanessa said something about the estate documents that had been filed in February. She'd had her own attorneys review the public filings. And Cole said, very casually, I wasn't aware those had been filed. And Vanessa said, well, they were. And there was a beat of silence. Then Miriam said quietly, did either of you actually ask Dad directly what the distribution looks like? And Cole said, have you? And Miriam said, he told me it was being finalized. And Vanessa said, he told me the same thing 3 months ago. It should have been finalized by now. Another silence. Maybe he's changed the timeline, Cole said. Or changed the plan, Vanessa said. I looked at Harold. He was sitting very still, looking at the paperwork in front of him, but not reading it. His expression was completely neutral, the expression of a man who is not surprised by anything he's hearing. Do you want me to? I started. No, he said quietly. Let them. From the kitchen, Miriam's voice. I don't think we should be talking about this. Cole dryly, you brought it up. I asked a question. I didn't suggest we... Nobody's suggesting anything, Vanessa said. I'm just pointing out that it's been months since the August dinner and we still have no clarity. Maybe he doesn't owe us clarity, Miriam said. Cole laughed, a short, humorless sound. Don't do that, Miriam. Don't play the saint right now. I'm not playing anything. You're there every other week, Cole said. Every other week for months. I love our father, but you're not there every other week because you miss him. A long silence. Then Miriam, in a voice very different from her usual soft tone, something flatter and harder underneath it. You'd be surprised what you understand about someone when you're actually present in their life. I watched Harold's jaw tighten, just slightly, just for a second. Then he picked up his pen and went back to the paperwork, and I understood that he had heard everything, and that it had cost him something, and that he wasn't going to show me how much. He passed in October. Quietly, in his own bed, on a Tuesday morning, with Miriam in the house, which I will grant her, she was there. She had been there for 5 days. And whatever else was true about her motivations, she was with him when it happened. The others drove down the same day. I drove down the same day. George Falk, the estate attorney, was notified and made arrangements for the reading to happen within the week, per Harold's specific instructions. The 3 days between Harold's death and the estate reading were some of the strangest days I've ever spent. The house was full of the particular organized chaos of grief, the phone calls and the catering arrangements and the decisions about the service and the flowers, all of which provided everyone with something useful to do and therefore a reason not to actually sit still and feel anything. Vanessa took charge of the logistics with an efficiency that might have been admirable under other circumstances. Cole handled the calls to Harold's business associates with the social ease he was genuinely gifted at. Miriam sat with family photographs for long stretches of time that might have been grief or might have been something else, and I couldn't always tell which. I handled Harold's personal correspondence, which he had asked me to do when we spoke on the phone 10 days before his death. One of our regular Sunday calls that had, in those last months, become long and unhurried and full of the kinds of things a man says when he's making peace with the shape of his life. He had sounded tired but clear. We talked about his brother, my father, who had passed 6 years earlier. We talked about Patricia. He told me a story about his first winter in business, when he couldn't make payroll and sat in his truck in a parking lot for 2 hours, trying to figure out what to do, and then went back inside and told his 4 employees the truth, and all 4 of them told him they'd work the next 2 weeks without pay. I never forgot that, he said. 4 people trusted me when I had nothing, not because of money, because of who I was. Then he said, Daniel, the envelope. I know, I said. Make sure George has it. He has a copy of everything, but the original needs to be with the will documents. I'll make sure, I said. Whatever happens, he said, I need you there. I'll be there, I said. He died 11 days later. IX. The estate reading was held at George Falk's firm in Charlottesville on a Thursday afternoon. A conference room with tall windows and a long table, and the particular hushed professional solemnity that legal offices deploy when the subject is death and money. Vanessa arrived in a black blazer that looked like it had been pressed that morning, which it probably had. Cole came in with Sandra, who sat to the side and slightly behind him in the way of a person who has been told their presence is for support rather than participation. Miriam came alone, in dark clothes, looking genuinely pale in a way that I thought was probably real. I sat to one side, not at the table exactly, but adjacent to it. George had arranged this. Harold had requested it. George Falk was a short, broad-shouldered man in his late 60s with a white beard and the kind of calm competence that only comes from decades of watching people at their most desperate. He had, in his professional lifetime, seen every possible variation of how families behave when a patriarch dies. I think very little surprised him anymore. I introduced himself formally, expressed his condolences, outlined the procedural aspects of the reading. The siblings sat with the precise, controlled stillness of people working very hard to look like they aren't bracing for something. Then George said, Before I proceed to the distribution documents, I've been instructed to present this. He reached to the side and placed the envelope on the center of the table. For my children, Harold's handwriting, the cream-colored envelope, battered at the corners. Vanessa looked at it for a moment. What is that? A letter from your father, George said. His specific instruction was that it be presented prior to the reading of the distribution documents. Cole leaned forward slightly. Is it part of the legal documents? It informs them, George said carefully. Miriam's hand moved toward the envelope, then stopped. Can we? Vanessa began, then seemed to reconsider. It's fine. We can read it after. Let's go through the documents first. George said gently but without flexibility. Your father's instructions were explicit. The letter first. A beat of silence. Cole said, All right. George picked up the envelope, opened it carefully, unfolded the pages inside. He smoothed them on the table and looked up. I'll read it as written, he said, and then Harold Whitmore spoke to his children one last time. X. George's voice steady and measured, carrying the weight of a dead man's words into a conference room in Charlottesville. To Vanessa, Cole, and Miriam, I have thought about how to begin this letter for a long time, and I keep returning to something your mother said to me in the first year we were married, when we were young and poor, and fighting constantly about things that seemed enormous and turned out to be nothing. She said, Harold, the only conversations worth having are the honest ones. Everything else is just noise. So I'm going to be honest with you, maybe for the first time in years. Maybe, if I'm truthful with myself, for the first time in a long time. I watched you this year, all 3 of you. I watched you come back to this house, more often than you had in years before. And I want to believe it was because you love me. Part of me does believe that. But I'm not so old and so tired that I cannot also see what else it was. You are my children. You are the best and worst things I have ever done with my life. I say that not to hurt you, but because it is true, and because you deserve the truth from me even when, especially when, it is hard. The estate is as follows. I have arranged for standard bequests that will provide each of you with a meaningful and immediate inheritance. Those will be outlined in the documents that follow this letter. The remainder, the largest portion of the estate, is held in a family trust. George paused, looked up. All 3 of the Whitmore children were absolutely still. He continued reading. The terms of the trust are unconventional. I will not apologize for that. The trust cannot be released to any individual beneficiary. It can only be released to all 3 of you, jointly, under one condition: that the three of you work together, under the guidance of an independent mediator, in documented sessions over a minimum period of 6 months, to restore the relationships between you that have deteriorated over the past decade and a half. I am not asking you to become best friends. I am not naive enough to want that, and I know you well enough not to expect it. I am asking you to become a family again, to tell the truth to each other, about the rivalry, about the resentment, about the competition, and the manipulation that has been going on between you longer than I want to admit I knew about. I am asking you to choose each other. If you cannot do this, or choose not to, the trust will be distributed to a charitable foundation. I have designated every penny of it. This is not a punishment. I need you to believe that. This is the last thing I know how to give you. I love you. I am angry with you. I am proud of you in ways I know I never said often enough. I am sorry for the ways I failed you, and I did fail you, in ways this letter is too short to fully account for. But I am your father, and a father's final job is to tell his children the truth. Harold. The room was silent for a very long time. Then Vanessa said, in a voice that was entirely steady, and somehow, because of that, more devastating than if it had broken. He watched us. Yes, George said. Cole's hands were flat on the table. He was looking at the envelope. His face was doing something complex and private. Miriam was crying, quietly, without making a production of it, just crying. I sat at the side of the room, and I thought about Harold in his study on that January evening, in the firelight, telling me about the condition, about the trust, about what he hoped for and what he feared. Whatever happens, he had said, I need you there. I was there. And what happened next? What those three people did with that letter, with that condition, with the weight of what their father had seen and still chosen to love, that is a story worth telling in full. But that part begins in the next room of this grief. And they hadn't walked into it yet. They were still sitting at the table, still deciding who they were going to be. The silence after George finished reading lasted long enough to become its own kind of statement. I counted because I didn't know what else to do with my hands or my eyes. 11 seconds. 12. 13. The kind of silence that isn't empty. It's full, packed tight with things nobody is ready to say out loud yet. Outside the tall windows, Charlottesville moved on in its ordinary October way, indifferent to the fact that three people at a conference table were sitting inside the wreckage of everything they thought they were about to receive. Vanessa broke it first, not with the words I expected, but with a question. How long has this trust been structured this way? George folded his hands on the table. Your father finalized the terms approximately 10 months ago. 10 months, Vanessa repeated. She said it without inflection, which somehow made it worse. Cole looked up from the envelope. So when he had us down for dinner, when he made the announcement in August, he already... The trust predates the dinner, yes, George said. Cole laughed. It was a short, involuntary sound. Not amused, not bitter exactly. Just the kind of laugh that escapes a person when their mind encounters something it genuinely can't process. He pressed his hand over his mouth immediately, as if embarrassed by it. Miriam had stopped crying, or at least she'd pulled the crying inward to somewhere private. She was looking at her hands in her lap. He watched us, she said quietly, echoing Vanessa's words from a minute ago, but differently, with a different weight behind them. Less outrage, more something that looked like shame. The condition, Vanessa said to George, the mediation requirement, walk me through exactly what that entails. George did. He explained it precisely, and without editorializing. An independent mediator, licensed and pre-approved by the trust terms, a minimum of 6 months of documented sessions, measurable benchmarks for what the trust defined as restored relational function. He explained that the trust had a 3-year window. If the condition was not met within 3 years of Harold's passing, the charitable distribution clause activated automatically and irrevocably. When he finished, Vanessa said, "That's insane." "Vanessa?" Miriam started. "I'm not being callous," Vanessa said sharply. "I'm being accurate. He's structuring the inheritance around a therapeutic process. That's Dad, of all people." "He's not here for you to argue with," Cole said, and his voice came out flatter than I think he intended. Vanessa looked at him. "I'm aware of that, Cole. Thank you. I'm just saying." "You're just saying," Vanessa repeated. "Right, because that's what you do. You just say things." And there it was. Less than 4 minutes since the letter had been read, and the civility was already cracking along its original fault lines. Sandra, sitting behind Cole, shifted slightly in her chair. I didn't move. George cleared his throat. I want to be clear that this session is not the appropriate moment for decisions to be made. You have time. The 3-year window is generous by design. Your father wanted you to have room to process before you decided anything. What are the standard bequests? Cole asked. You said there were standard bequests. George outlined them. Each of the 3 children received a direct inheritance, enough to be genuinely significant, enough to provide real financial security. Not the kind of life-changing fortune that the trust represented, but not nothing. Harold had made sure of that. He hadn't wanted his children to be desperate. He wanted them to have a choice. Cole nodded slowly when George finished. Doing the math, probably. I could see it on his face, the calculation running behind his eyes, the comparing of what he was getting against what he'd anticipated, against what the trust held in reserve. Vanessa said, I'd like a copy of all the trust documents tonight. Of course, George said. I'll have my assistant prepare the package. Miriam said nothing. She was still looking at her hands. The meeting ended 20 minutes later. George offered coffee that nobody wanted, expressed his condolences again with the genuine warmth of a man who had known Harold for decades, and then stood back and let the room breathe. I waited until the others had moved toward the door before I stood up. As we filed out into the corridor, Cole fell into step beside me. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, low, not quite a whisper, Did you know about the trust? I looked at him. Daniel, he said. Your father asked me to be present today, I said. That's what I can tell you. Cole looked at me for a long moment with an expression I hadn't seen on him before. Something stripped of the easy charm, something more raw and less managed. Then he nodded once and walked ahead toward where Sandra was waiting. Vanessa passed me in the corridor without speaking. She had her phone out already, typing something, her face back in its composed professional arrangement, the machinery of her running at full speed because that was how she handled things. She immediately converted emotion into action, grief into logistics, loss into legal strategy. I stood in the corridor and watched all 3 of them move toward the elevator, and I thought about Harold saying, I love you. I am angry with you. I understood both, fully, for the first time. The funeral was 2 days later, on a gray Saturday, with the kind of cold that settles into your coat and doesn't leave. The service was held at a small Episcopal church in Charlottesville that Harold had attended irregularly but respectfully for 30 years. Patricia was buried in the churchyard, and the plan was to lay Harold beside her. About 200 people came. Employees, former employees, business associates, neighbors, old friends from Harold's West Virginia years who had driven long distances to be there. There were people in that church who owed their livelihoods to Harold Whitmore, and they sat in those pews with a grief that was uncomplicated and real. The siblings gave eulogies, all 3 of them. Vanessa's was polished and precise, organized around 3 central memories, delivered in the composed tone of a woman who had written it out and rehearsed it enough times to get through it without breaking. It was, I want to be fair here, genuinely moving. She talked about Harold teaching her to drive in an empty parking lot when she was 15, and his patience when she kept stalling the engine, and how he'd said, Vanessa, the only way to learn anything is to not be afraid to be bad at it first. She got through the whole thing without her voice cracking, which I suspect cost her enormously. Cole's was less rehearsed and because of that, in some ways, more affecting. He stumbled twice. He lost his place once and stood at the podium just breathing for a few seconds before finding it again. He talked about Harold coming to his first real business meeting. A small thing, a presentation to a regional bank. Nothing. Harold needed to attend. And standing in the back of the room and nodding when Cole looked over his shoulder, and how that nod had meant everything, more than any amount of money or advice. Cole's voice broke on the last sentence, and he had to stop, and Sandra was quietly crying in the front row, and half the church went with her. Miriam didn't give a formal eulogy. Instead, she read a short poem, one she said she'd written herself, the previous night, sitting in Harold's study. It was only 12 lines long. I don't remember all of it, but I remember the last 2 lines. You gave us everything you built, but what we needed was more time. Several people around me made involuntary sounds when she read that, the kind you can't hold back. I sat in the 3rd row and I watched all 3 of them, and I felt the complicated, exhausting reality of being a human being, which is that people can be greedy and grieving simultaneously. They can be calculating and heartbroken at the same time. Vanessa standing at that podium was not performing her grief. She was actually in it, even as part of her was already thinking about trust documents and legal strategies. Cole breaking down at the podium was completely real, even though 2 days ago he'd been doing math in a conference room. Miriam's poem was genuine, I believe that, even though she'd been running distribution scenarios with a financial advisor 6 months earlier. People are not one thing. Harold knew that. It's why the letter said what it said. It didn't make any of it easier to watch. The days after the funeral have a particular quality that I don't have good words for. The official grief recedes slightly, enough to function, and what's left is a kind of exhausted rawness. Everything feels slightly too loud and slightly too bright, and ordinary tasks feel weirdly enormous. The three siblings stayed in Charlottesville for a week. Part of this was practical. There were estate matters to handle, Harold's personal belongings to begin sorting, the house to think about. Part of it was, I think, none of them quite ready to return to their separate lives yet, because returning to their separate lives would mean the transition was real. I stayed too. Louise drove down on Sunday and stayed through the week with me, and her presence was, as it always is, a kind of ballast. She made coffee in the mornings and sat with whoever was awake and asked good questions and didn't try to fix anything. The three siblings were in the house together every day that week, which meant I saw things I probably wasn't meant to see and heard things I definitely wasn't meant to hear. The first real confrontation happened on Monday night. I was in the kitchen, late, 11 o'clock maybe, unable to sleep, making tea because it gave my hands something to do. I heard voices from the living room and recognized them as Cole and Vanessa, and I should have gone back upstairs, but I didn't. I stood at the kitchen counter and I listened. Told me you were already talking to Hargrove's firm, Cole was saying. Not loudly, but with a tightness in his voice that had nothing to do with volume. Sandra's friend works there, Vanessa. It got back to me. I have been consulting with attorneys, Vanessa said, completely calm. That is my right, and frankly, my professional obligation. You've been consulting with them since August, since the dinner. A pause. Cole? Just tell me yes or no. Another pause, longer. Then, yes. So you've had 4 months of legal preparation, and none of us knew about it. I didn't have an obligation to inform you about my private legal consultations. No, Cole said. No, you didn't. You also didn't have an obligation to sit at Dad's table in August and make all the right faces while you already had attorneys on standby. But here we are. Don't do this, Vanessa said, and for the first time there was something other than composure in her voice, something with an edge. Don't stand there and act like you weren't making your own calculations. I know about the phone calls, Cole. I know you've been having the Blue Ridge project reevaluated for the past 3 months in anticipation of. Don't pretend you weren't positioning yourself. That's completely different. How? How is it different? You were planning to use the inheritance to fund a project. I was planning to manage the estate efficiently. We were both thinking about money. The only difference is you like your version better than mine. I heard Cole exhale, a long, frustrated sound. Then, the trust, the condition. Are you going to do it? A longer silence this time. I don't know, Vanessa said. Vanessa. I said I don't know. It's been 4 days since Dad died. I'm not ready to make that decision. We don't have to decide tonight, Cole said, and some of the tension had gone out of his voice. But we have to decide. I know that. And Miriam, don't start with Miriam. She was here every other week for 8 months, Cole said. You know as well as I do. Cole, not tonight. A long silence. Then the sound of one of them moving, the creak of the floorboard near the hall door. I moved back from the counter as quietly as I could, but it didn't matter. Neither of them came into the kitchen. The house settled back into quiet. I stood there holding my tea, thinking about 2 adults who loved their father and betrayed him and lost him, and were now trying to work out what they were made of, in a house that was suddenly too quiet and too empty. At 11 o'clock on a Monday night, I thought, Harold, you knew exactly what you were doing. I thought, I hope it works. The Miriam situation came to a head on Wednesday. It came from an unexpected direction. Cole's wife Sandra, quiet Sandra, support role Sandra, who I had significantly underestimated, came to me in the late morning while Miriam was in the garden, and Vanessa was on the phone with her attorneys, and Cole was somewhere in the back of the house. She came into the kitchen where I was sitting with Louise, and she sat down across from me, and she said, "Daniel, I need to tell you something, and I don't know if it's my place, but I think somebody needs to know." "Okay," I said. Sandra had known Harold for 20 years. She'd come into the family as a young woman when she married Cole, and she had, I think, loved Harold in an uncomplicated, daughterly way that his actual children sometimes couldn't manage because of everything that was layered underneath it. When Harold declined to co-sign Cole's loan, Sandra had been the one to counsel Cole against making it into a war. She had a kind of even-tempered moral clarity that I trusted. "I was talking to Elliot yesterday," she said. "Miriam's partner. He called to offer condolences, and we ended up talking for a while." "I know Elliot," I said. "He's worried about Miriam," Sandra said. "He's been worried for months. He said that in the spring, around March or April, Miriam started talking about the estate in a way that concerned him, not just casually, in a way that suggested she'd been making plans." "What kind of plans?" Louise asked. Sandra looked at her hands. According to Elliot, Miriam had been telling him she believed Harold intended to leave the gallery to her specifically, outside the standard distribution. A building he owned in Charlottesville, commercial property, valuable. She'd apparently told Elliot that Harold had promised it to her. I felt something shift in my chest. Harold never told me about that promise. "Elliot didn't think it was real either," Sandra said. "He thought Miriam had... He said she had started to believe her own version of things. He said she'd been talking to Harold differently, asking questions in ways that, Elliot's word, were leading. Like she was trying to get him to say things she could hold on to," Louise said. "Yes," Sandra said. "And he said she was devastated after the estate reading. Not just grieving, something else. He said she called him that night and she was different, angry in a way she hadn't been before. She said something like he knew exactly what he was doing and he did it anyway." I sat with that for a moment. Harold had known exactly what he was doing. That was true. He'd built the entire structure of the trust with his eyes fully open about who his children were. But hearing it described as a betrayal from Miriam, who had held his hand at Patricia's grave, who had read a poem at his funeral, something about that combination sat in me like a cold weight. "Does Cole know any of this?" I asked. "Not yet," Sandra said. "I'm telling you first because I think you'd know how to handle it, or whether it even needs to be handled." I told her I needed to think. She nodded and left. Louise looked at me across the kitchen table. "You're going to have to tell them," she said. "I know. Not today. No, not today." She reached across the table and put her hand over mine. She didn't say anything else. She didn't need to. The week ended with all three siblings still in the house, still in the carefully maintained detente of shared grief, all of them carrying the weight of what Harold's letter had asked, and none of them yet willing to say out loud what they were going to do about it. On Thursday evening, I found Miriam in Harold's study. She was sitting in his chair, the big leather one behind the desk, with her legs tucked under her and a glass of wine balanced on the armrest. She wasn't doing anything, just sitting in his chair, in the room that still smelled like him. I stood in the doorway and she looked up and she said, "Come in, Daniel." I came in and sat across from her in one of the side chairs. "I know you know something," she said. "Miriam..." "Not from whatever Sandra's been saying," she said, and I kept my expression neutral, though she clearly already knew. "From before. You were here in January. I know Dad called you that Sunday night. He told me he had." I waited. "What did he tell you?" she asked, and her voice was very controlled. The kind of control that means the thing underneath it is large. "He told me he was worried about his children," I said. "All three of you, equally." "That's not all." "No," I said. "That's not all." She looked at me, and I looked at her, and after a long moment she said, "I love him, Daniel. I want you to know that. Whatever. I genuinely loved him." "I know you did," I said. "And I also," she said slowly, like she was lifting each word carefully, "got very lost in what I wanted versus what was real. And I knew I was getting lost, and I didn't stop because I told myself I deserved that after everything I'd done, being present, being there." She stopped. "I told myself I'd earned a different outcome, and that is..." Her jaw tightened. "That is a very ugly thing to have to say about yourself." I didn't tell her she was being too hard on herself. I didn't tell her it was understandable, or that everyone makes mistakes, or any of the comfortable things, that would have let her off the hook too easily. Harold wouldn't have, and I thought she deserved better than cheap comfort. The question now, I said, is what you do with knowing that about yourself. She looked at me for a long time. The mediation, she said finally. Yeah. You think we should do it? I think your father built you a door, I said. What you do with it isn't up to me. Miriam looked down at her wine glass, then back up at the bookshelves. All Harold's books, in Harold's order, in Harold's room. She looked like she was memorizing it. He knew, she said quietly. He knew everything, and he still, her voice caught, he still found a way to love us through it. That was the truest thing anyone said that whole week. I sat with her in the study until the wine was gone and the room got dark, and neither of us turned on the light for a long time. And I thought about Harold in that chair in that room, writing the letter. A father's final job is to tell his children the truth. He had done his job. Whether his children would do theirs was still an open question. But something had shifted. I could feel it. Faint, fragile, like the first crack in ice at the end of a long winter. Not warmth yet, not resolution, just the first small sign that the freeze might not last forever. Whether that was enough, I honestly didn't know. 3 weeks passed before any of them made a decision. I know because I was counting. Not obsessively. I wasn't sitting by the phone marking days on a calendar. But because I knew Harold had been counting on this part. The aftermath. The moment when the grief weight lifted just enough for self-interest to creep back in, and the real test of who his children were would begin. Vanessa called me first, on a Tuesday morning in early November, while I was at my own desk in my own office for the first time in weeks, trying to remember how to be a person with a regular life. She opened with pleasantries that neither of us had the energy for, and then she said, I've had my attorneys review the trust documents thoroughly. And? I said. And it's airtight, she said, with a kind of flat admiration that I recognized as a lawyer acknowledging another lawyer's good work. George Falk built it well. There's no challenge angle that my team can identify that would hold up in court. Harold was of sound mind. The terms are legal. The charitable provision is ironclad. A pause. He was thorough. He was always thorough, I said. Yes, she said, and then quieter. I underestimated him. I think I have been underestimating him for a long time. That admission from Vanessa was the equivalent of anyone else breaking down entirely. I recognized it for what it was, and didn't make her repeat it. What are you thinking about the mediation? I asked. I'm thinking, she said carefully, that I have spent the last 3 weeks trying to find a reason not to do it, and I can't find one that doesn't make me sound like exactly the person Dad described in that letter. I didn't say anything. I haven't talked to Cole or Miriam yet, she said. I wanted to think it through myself first. Old habit. A dry pause. Apparently. Does Cole know you've had it reviewed? Probably, she said. He usually knows things. It's annoying. The way she said it, there was something almost warm underneath the irritation, some old sibling frequency that was still live even after everything. Then it was gone. I'll call them this week. She did. I know because Cole called me the following Thursday and said, without introduction, Vanessa wants to do the mediation. What do you want? I asked. Cole was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, something in his voice was different from the smooth, managed version I was used to. Something tired and a little scraped. Sandra and I had a long talk last week, he said, about a lot of things. About the hotel project and what it was really about. About what I've been chasing and whether it's what I actually want or just what I'm afraid to stop wanting. He stopped. She's a good person, Daniel. She's a much better person than I deserve right now. Don't say that to me, I said. Say it to her. I did, he said. She cried. It was a hard night. Good, I said, and I meant it without cruelty. I'm going to do the mediation, Cole said. I decided before Vanessa called. I want you to know that. Okay, I said. I don't know what's going to come out of it, he said. I don't know if we're capable of... Vanessa and I have 15 years of garbage between us. And Miriam... He stopped. Miriam called George Falk on her own, I said. 2 weeks ago. She told him she agreed to the condition. A long silence. She did? She did. Another silence. Then Cole said, Huh. Just that. Huh. like a man recalculating a map he thought he knew. The mediator's name was Dr. Renata Osei. She was in her mid-50s, a conflict resolution specialist who had spent the last 2 decades working primarily with family business disputes and estate conflicts, which meant she had seen, in professional depth, exactly what the Whitmore children were walking into. George Falk had selected her from a pre-approved list that Harold himself had reviewed and signed off on, which meant that even in this, Harold had been one step ahead. The first session was held in the second week of November at a neutral office in Charlottesville, a comfortable space, deliberate in its neutrality, the kind of room designed to feel like no particular person's territory. I wasn't in the room. I want to be clear about that. The mediation sessions were private, as they should have been, and what I know about them comes from what the siblings told me afterward, in pieces, over months, often reluctantly. But I know enough. What I know is that the first session lasted 4 hours and ended with Cole walking out 20 minutes before it was officially over. Miriam told me this on the phone that evening, her voice careful. Renata asked us each to describe our relationship with Dad in 3 words, she said. Vanessa said complicated, formative, unfinished. I said close, imperfect, real. Cole said insufficient, pressured, conditional. That's more than 3 words, I said. Renata let it go, Miriam said. And then she asked us to describe our relationship with each other, and Vanessa said, she stopped. I could hear her choosing. Vanessa said that her relationship with Cole had been characterized by what she called asymmetric accountability, which is a very Vanessa way of saying that she believed she always did more and got less credit for it. How did Cole respond? He laughed, Miriam said. Not meanly, just that short laugh he does when something hits close. And then he said, Vanessa, the last time we had a real conversation that wasn't about Dad or money was 3 years ago. And it was because Sandra's mom was sick and you called to check in. That's the only time in 3 years you called just to be a sister. And Vanessa said, that's not true. And Cole said, I know the date, March 14th, 19-minute call. And Vanessa went very quiet. I let that sit for a second. And then Cole walked out? No, that was later, Miriam said. It was when Renata asked about the loan. The co-signing thing, 3 years ago. She'd clearly done her research beforehand, or Harold had provided notes. I'm not sure which. She asked Cole directly how he felt when Harold declined, and Cole started to give the diplomatic answer, and Renata interrupted him. She said, I don't need the diplomatic answer. I need the real one. And Cole looked at her, and then he looked at Vanessa, and he said, I felt like he chose her again, the way he always chose her. And I've spent 3 years telling myself it was a business decision, but if I'm honest, it felt like being 8 years old again and watching him take Vanessa to a work event instead of my school play. It felt like that. I was quiet. And Vanessa said, Miriam's voice tightened. Vanessa said, Cole, I didn't know about the school play. And Cole said, that's exactly the problem. And then he got up and left. He came back for the second session. That mattered. It mattered not because walking out was unforgivable. It wasn't. Renata apparently told all 3 of them that blow-ups and exits were part of the process, that she'd seen far worse in the first session, but because coming back was a choice. Cole drove to Charlottesville on a gray December morning knowing it was going to be hard, and he sat back down in that room, and that was its own kind of statement about who he was underneath the charm and the maneuvering. December and January were grinding. I don't want to make it sound otherwise. The sessions happened twice a month, and between sessions the siblings had homework. Renata called them structured conversations, which meant they were supposed to call each other, individually, for a purpose other than logistics. Cole was supposed to call Vanessa. Vanessa was supposed to call Miriam. Miriam was supposed to call Cole. This sounds simple. It was not simple. Cole called me after his first assigned call with Vanessa and said, we talked for 11 minutes, and it was so awkward I wanted to walk into traffic. How'd it end? I asked. She said she hoped Sandra's mom was doing better. Out of nowhere. I didn't even mention Sandra's mom. He was quiet for a second. I think that was her trying. It was her trying, I said. It was terrible, he said. Most trying is, I said. I was quiet again. Then, you know what the worst part is? I miss her. I've missed her for years. I don't know how to be in a room with her without the whole history coming in with us. You're going to have to learn, I said. I know. A pause. I hate that Dad is the one who figured out how to make us do this. He knew you'd never do it on your own, I said. Cole said, yeah. And there was something in that word that was half acknowledgement and half grief, the particular grief of understanding someone only after they're gone. The Miriam situation was its own difficult thing, moving on its own separate track. In January, almost 3 months after Harold's passing, the truth about the Charlottesville property came fully to the surface. Not because Sandra said anything to the group, but because Renata surfaced it herself in session. Harold, it emerged, had indeed left notes with George Falk. Detailed ones. A kind of companion document to the letter, containing things he'd observed about each of his children that he had chosen not to put in the letter itself. Observations that were more specific and, in some cases, harder. About Miriam, Harold had written, "She has convinced herself that time and presence are currency, that love can be earned retroactively through proximity. I understand where this comes from. She has always needed to believe her effort would be rewarded. But I have watched her, this past year, confuse caring for me with positioning herself. The two can coexist, and I believe her love is genuine. And I also believe she has told herself a story about what she deserves that has stopped being about me and started being about her own need for security. I am not angry. I am worried." Renata read this to Miriam in the third session, with Vanessa and Cole present. "I know this because Miriam called me afterward, and she was not soft-voiced and composed. She was angry. He wrote that about me," she said. He wrote that down and gave it to his attorney." "Miriam, I know," she said. "I know what you're going to say, that he was right, that it's fair, and maybe it is. But it is incredibly painful to have your dead father's most accurate assessment of your worst self read to you by a stranger while your siblings are sitting right there." "Was he wrong?" I asked. A long, terrible silence. "No," she said finally, very quietly. "He wasn't wrong." "Okay," I said. "I told myself I deserved more because I was there more," she said. "I told myself that being present was the same as being selfless. And it wasn't. I was present for him, yes, but I was also present for—" She stopped, started again. "I was present for the version of the outcome I had already decided on in my head. And when the outcome was different, I felt—" Another stop. "I called Elliot the night of the estate reading, and I said, he knew what he was doing and he did it anyway. Like he had wronged me. Like my father, who built everything he had from nothing, and worked his whole life and was the most honest person in my life, had somehow wronged me by not giving me what I had decided I was owed." She started crying then, for real, not the controlled variety. "I am so ashamed of that," she said. "I am so ashamed." I stayed on the phone with her for a long time. I didn't try to fix it. You can't fix that kind of reckoning. You can only keep someone company while they go through it. February was when the thing between Cole and Vanessa cracked open in a way none of us anticipated. It happened not in a mediation session, but in a phone call. The structured conversation assignment that had, by February, become slightly less excruciating and slightly more real. They'd been on the phone for about 20 minutes, apparently, when Cole mentioned in passing that he'd been contacted by one of Harold's former business partners about a project, and that he'd turned it down. "Why?" Vanessa asked, which was more than she usually offered. And Cole said, "Because I've been thinking about what Dad said. In the letter. About the legacy. About it not being the numbers on a piece of paper." He paused. "I've been thinking about what I'm actually building, versus what I keep chasing." Vanessa was quiet for a moment. Then she said something that Cole repeated to me almost verbatim, because he said he'd replayed it 10 times and still wasn't sure what to do with it. She said, "I have a son at boarding school in Connecticut who calls me less than he calls his friends' parents. And I have spent the last 8 years telling myself it was because of the divorce, or his age, or the distance, or any number of things that were not me. And the thing I keep coming back to, since Dad's letter, since all of this, is that Carter has watched me my whole adult life prioritize positioning over presence. Exactly what Dad watched us do this year. My son learned it from me." Cole said he didn't know what to say to that. Vanessa said, "You don't have to say anything. I'm saying it out loud for the first time." And Cole said, "Vanessa, for what it's worth, you showed up at that podium and you held it together and you said something real about him. I saw you afterward, when you thought nobody was looking. You sat in the car for 20 minutes before you drove away." Another silence. Vanessa said, that I didn't think anyone noticed. I noticed, Cole said. That call lasted 2 hours. Cole told me about it with the slightly dazed expression of a man who had discovered a room in a house he thought he knew completely. By March, 5 months in, the sessions had shifted into something that Renata apparently described as the accountability phase, which was the part where the comfortable grievances got set down and the harder ones had to be picked up. And the hardest one had been waiting since the beginning. It came out in the 5th session, on a cold Tuesday in March, when Renata asked each of them to speak directly about what they had done. Not what the others had done to them, not the history, not the inheritance, what they personally had done to damage the family in the years before Harold died. Vanessa went first. She talked about the loan she'd advocated against, the one she'd quietly, separately told Harold was a bad investment after Cole had already asked for support. She had done this. She admitted it plainly, without softening it. She had made a business argument to their father against her brother's project, and she had not told Cole, and she had done it partly because she believed the numbers were bad, and partly because she had always, somewhere underneath the professional composure, been competing with him, and that particular version of competition was one she wasn't proud of. Cole looked at her across the room. "You told him to refuse the cosign," he said. "I offered an analysis," Vanessa said. "I want to be accurate. I didn't tell him what to do. But I gave him the ammunition, yes." Cole was quiet for a long time, long enough that Renata didn't intervene. Then he said, "I spent 3 years believing Dad made that call alone, and I was angry at him for it." His voice was controlled, but barely. "You took that from me, the chance to be angry at the right person." "I know," Vanessa said. "I grieved that loan, Vanessa. Not just the money, the belief that he'd chosen you over me again. I carried that about him and he wasn't even, it was you." "I know," she said again. "Why?" She looked at him across the room, and to her credit, she didn't look away. "Because I was afraid you'd succeed," she said. "Because you charm every room you walk into, and I work 3 times as hard to be taken half as seriously, and I've been afraid since we were children that someday you'd just sail past me on nothing but charm and a good idea, and that is—" She stopped. "That is the pettiest, most embarrassing sentence I have ever said out loud. And I need you to know I've known it was true for a long time, and I just never had to admit it to your face before." The room was very quiet. Then Cole said something I didn't expect. He said, "I have never in my life thought you weren't the smartest person in any room you walked into." Vanessa looked at him like he'd said it in a foreign language. "I copied your homework in 9th grade, he said. "You never knew. I copied it 4 times because you were so far ahead of me, and I couldn't tell you because I would have had to admit you were better. And I was 17 and too stupid to say so." He shook his head slightly. "I have never not known how good you are, Vanessa. I was just too busy competing with you to say it." Miriam, who had been silent through all of this, made a sound that was close to a laugh and close to a sob, and came out as neither. I wasn't in the room for any of this. But when Miriam described it to me afterwards, sitting in the kitchen of the estate on the drive back, she said, "Daniel, they sounded like, for about 30 seconds, they sounded like the people they were supposed to be." "Yeah?" I said. "Like the versions of themselves that existed before everything." She looked at her wine glass. "Before money got into it, before all of us got so scared." I thought about Harold in his study, in January, with the firelight moving across his face. Good people can become unrecognizable when fear and greed get into them together. He had been right. He had been right about everything. And the question, the one that had been living inside all of this since October, since the envelope, since the conference room, was whether being right was enough. Whether seeing your children clearly was the same as saving them. Whether a letter and a trust and a condition could do what 30 years of imperfect fathering hadn't quite managed. I didn't know the answer yet. None of us did. But on that cold March night, sitting in Harold Whitmore's kitchen with his youngest daughter, I thought for the first time that maybe, not certainly, not cleanly, not without a long way still to go, but maybe the door Harold built was actually going to be used. Maybe that was enough to keep going on. Spring came to Charlottesville, the way it always does. Gradually, then all at once, the bare garden at Harold's estate filling back in with the particular stubbornness of things that have survived a hard winter. I drove out there in early April to help George Falk's office with some remaining administrative matters. and I stood in the driveway for a moment before going inside, looking at the garden Patricia had planted 30 years ago, and Harold had kept alive for 20 years after her. And I thought about how much work it takes to maintain something beautiful when the person who created it is gone. That was where the Whitmore family was, 6 months after Harold's passing, still standing, still trying to figure out what it meant to maintain something that had been built by someone else, with someone else's hands, for reasons that hadn't always been visible until those reasons were written in a letter and read aloud in a conference room. The mediation was ongoing. April brought the sixth session, which Renata had described to George, who reported back to me in the careful, appropriate way of a man who understood what Harold had intended for my role in all of this, as a turning point. Not a resolution, a turning point. There's a significant difference, and I want to be honest about that distinction because too many stories about broken families skip over it. They jump from the moment of confrontation to the moment of healing, as if there's nothing in between, as if truth-telling is the last hard thing and everything after is just paperwork. It isn't. The truth-telling, it turned out, was only the beginning of the hard part. What came after was the question of what you did with the truth once you had it. And for three people who had spent decades building identities around not being wrong, the adjustment required was enormous and daily and frequently ugly. Vanessa's crisis came first, and it came from the direction I least expected. Not from Cole, not from Miriam, but from her son. Carter Whitmore was 17, sharp, and had inherited his mother's gift for precise language and his father's emotional unavailability in a combination that made him, when he was at his best, genuinely perceptive, and when he was at his worst, withering. He came home from his Connecticut boarding school for spring break in late March, a week after the fifth session, and Vanessa brought him to Charlottesville to help with some of Harold's personal effects. Framed photographs, small furniture pieces, books that had been designated in the will for family members. Cole was there that day. And me. What I witnessed between Carter and Vanessa wasn't a dramatic confrontation. It was worse than that. It was the quiet, almost clinical way Carter moved through his grandfather's house, occasionally asking questions that had the precision of someone who had done a lot of private thinking and was finally deciding to say things out loud. They were in the study, going through Harold's bookshelves, when Carter picked up a framed photograph. One I recognized, Harold and Patricia, and three young children at what looked like a beach somewhere, summer, everyone squinting into the sun. "How old are you here?" Carter asked Vanessa. Vanessa glanced at it. "Maybe 9 or 10. That's Myrtle Beach. Your grandfather took us every summer through. I think until Miriam was about 12. Carter looked at the photo for a moment. "Did you do stuff like that with me? Vacations like that?" Vanessa said, carefully. "We went to the Outer Banks when you were 7. "Once," Carter said. "Carter, I'm not trying to start something," he said, and his tone was so level it was almost disarming. "I'm genuinely asking because I've been thinking about Grandpa Harold since he died, and I've been trying to figure out what I actually know about him. And I realized I don't know that much because I didn't spend time with him." He set the photo back on the shelf. And I didn't spend time with him because you and I we don't have the kind of relationship where I know how to ask to do things with you. And I've been wondering how long that's been true." Vanessa was very still. "I'm not blaming you," Carter said, which paradoxically made it worse. I think he would have wanted me to say it. He was the kind of person who wanted things said." Cole was standing near the door, and I saw him look at the floor. Not to avoid watching, to give Vanessa a private moment inside the room, even while he was still physically in it. It was a small thing, but it was decent. Vanessa said, "I know," and her voice came out smaller than I had ever heard it. "Carter, I know." "Okay," he said simply, and went back to the books. That was it. That was the whole thing. No raised voices, no dramatic reckoning, just a 17-year-old being honest with his mother in his dead grandfather's study, while the spring light came through the windows and the garden outside filled back in, and a 51-year-old woman understood in a way she hadn't before that the patterns she was trying to break with her siblings were the same patterns she had already passed down. I stepped out of the room because I didn't belong in it anymore, and I stood in the hallway and I thought about Harold's letter. "I am sorry for the ways I failed you. And I did fail you, in ways this letter is too short to fully account for." Vanessa hadn't written a letter. But maybe, I thought, she was starting to understand why he had. Cole's reckoning came at a slower burn, which suited him. Cole had always processed things sideways, circling a hard truth repeatedly before landing on it directly. It came to a head in late April, when the consulting firm Cole had been running went through a rough quarterly review that exposed what he had privately known for a year and publicly denied for almost as long. The business wasn't growing the way he had told people it was growing, not fraudulently. Cole was many things, but he wasn't dishonest in his financial reporting. But he had been optimistic in his projections in the particular way of a man who believes that if he says a thing confidently enough, it will eventually become true. Sandra had known. She had known for most of a year, and she had not said anything because Cole had not been ready to hear it, and because there had been Harold's illness and Harold's death, and the estate and the mediation filling every available space. But in late April, sitting at their kitchen table in Richmond on a Sunday afternoon with the quarterly documents between them, she finally said it. "We need to talk about what this actually looks like," she said. And Cole, to his credit, finally, painfully, at the age of 47, didn't deflect. He told me about it the following week. He'd called me on a Wednesday evening, and he sounded tired in the particular way of a man who has recently set down something heavy he'd been carrying for too long and hadn't realized how much it weighed until it was on the ground. "Sandra said something to me," he said. "She said, 'Cole, you have spent our entire marriage trying to outrun your father's legacy instead of building your own. And I think you know that, and I think it's time to stop.'" I didn't say anything. "She's right," he said. Every time I started something new, every pitch and every deal and every venture, it was always partly about proving something. To him, to Vanessa, to myself." He paused. "And the thing is, he never actually asked me to prove anything. That was all in my head. I built the whole competition myself." "Most competitions are," I said. "He never compared me to Vanessa out loud," Cole said. "Not once that I can remember. I always assumed he was comparing us internally, and I was always trying to win that comparison, and I have no idea if the comparison was even happening." He laughed. "The short, real one, not the performed version. I wasted an embarrassing amount of energy on a competition that may have been entirely imaginary." "Not entirely," I said. "What Vanessa did with the loan was real." "Yeah," he said. "Yeah, that was real, and I'm dealing with that." A pause. "Renata has us doing individual work between sessions now. Writing things down. I've been writing down, it sounds stupid, I've been writing letters to Dad, not to send anywhere, just to write." "That doesn't sound stupid," I said. "They're not pretty," he said. "The first one was just angry, like 3 pages of anger I didn't know I'd been holding." He paused. "The second one was better, more honest. I talked about the school play, the one he missed." "Did you know at the time that it was Vanessa's event he went to instead?" "No," Cole said. "I found that out from Renata, who found it in Dad's notes. He wrote about it. He wrote that he had made a choice that day, and he wasn't sure it was the right one, and that Cole didn't say anything about it afterward, and that the not saying anything worried him more than if I had been angry." He was quiet. "He noticed, he saw it, and he worried about it, and he didn't say anything, and I didn't say anything, and we both just carried it." "For 40 years, I said. "For 40 years, Cole agreed. I thought about Harold in his study that January evening, telling me he'd been trying to figure out when it changed. When they stopped coming to see him and started coming to measure what would be theirs. I thought about how much a person can love their children and still fail to bridge the distances that accumulate over decades of small silences and unasked questions. "You know what I keep thinking about?" Cole said. "That last Sunday call you had with him, before he died. He told me about it. He said you two talked for a long time." "We did," I said. Was he scared?" I considered this question honestly. "No," I said, "not scared. He was ready. He wanted the letter to do what he needed it to do." Cole was quiet. "He talked about the 4 employees who worked for nothing when he couldn't make payroll," I said, "about how they trusted him when he had nothing. He said he never forgot what that felt like, to be trusted before you'd proven you deserved it." "He never told us that story," Cole said. "Not once." "He told me," I said. "He told me because I asked him about the beginning. Most people didn't ask him about the beginning." A long silence. Then Cole said very quietly, "I should have asked him about the beginning." There was nothing useful I could say to that, so I didn't try. "What?" The hardest thing, the thing that I had been bracing for since March, happened in May. It happened not between siblings, but between Miriam and Elliot, and it reshaped the whole landscape of what the mediation was working toward in ways nobody had fully anticipated. Elliot left, not dramatically. There was no explosive scene, no slammed door, no thrown accusations. Elliot was, as Miriam had always described him, uncomplicated. And when a person who has spent years being uncomplicated finally decides to leave, they tend to do it quietly and with a completeness that is almost more devastating than anger. He told Miriam in early May that he had been watching her go through the mediation process and watching her genuinely try to become something different, and that he was proud of her for it, and that he also had to be honest about something he'd been avoiding. He said that their relationship had been, for the last several years, built primarily around Miriam's needs, her career, her family drama, her gallery, her anxiety about money, her complicated relationship with Harold, and that he had allowed that to happen because he loved her and because he was, by nature, someone who minimized his own requirements. But that he had done a lot of thinking over the past several months, watching Miriam go through an honest accounting of her choices, and he'd started doing his own honest accounting. And his honest accounting said that he had been lonely inside their relationship for a long time, and that the loneliness had been so gradual and so quiet that he'd almost missed it himself. Miriam called me that night at 9 o'clock, and when I picked up, she said without any preamble, "Elliot ended things." I waited. "He did it kindly," she said. "That's almost worse. He sat across from me, and he was so gentle about it, and so clear, and all I could think was that I had done that to him. I had made him so accustomed to being the background of his own life, that when he finally put himself in the foreground, it came out like a goodbye." "Miriam, don't tell me I'll be okay," she said. "I know I'll be okay eventually. I don't want to be told I'll be okay right now." "Okay," I said. "I want to tell you something," she said. "Something I haven't said out loud to anyone." "Tell me." "I think," she said slowly, "that the version of myself who spent 8 months visiting Dad, sitting with him, holding his hand, I think that version was real. I think I genuinely loved him. And I also think that somewhere in those 8 months, I started layering things on top of the love, using the love as a justification for the wanting, and the two things got so tangled together that I couldn't tell them apart anymore, and that," her voice tightened, "that is a very frightening thing to realize about yourself. That you can love someone completely and still be using them." Besati. I sat with that for a moment because it deserved to be sat with. "Miriam," I said finally, "I think that's one of the most honest things I've heard anyone say in 8 months." "It doesn't feel good," she said. "No," I said. "Honesty usually doesn't until it's had a while to settle." She cried for a bit. I stayed on the phone. Outside my window, Louise had left the porch light on, which she always did when I was on a long call late, so I could see it from the kitchen. That small, ordinary brightness. When Miriam had steadied, she said, "Renata asked me last session what I thought Dad wanted for me. Not the gallery. Not the money. Me." "What did you say?" I asked. "I said I didn't know," she said. And she said, "That might be the most important thing to figure out." A pause. "Daniel," Miriam said, "did he say anything about me in your conversations? Anything that was just about me, not about the estate or the dynamics or any of it, just..." I thought about January, about the firelight and the bourbon, and the man who was 82 years old and tired and clear-eyed and loved his children in ways he had never quite found the right vehicle for. "He said you reminded him of your mother," I said. "Not in a sentimental way, in a specific way. He said Patricia had the same quality, the ability to make a person feel genuinely heard. He said it was a rare thing and that you had it, and that he hoped you used it for yourself as much as you used it for other people." A long silence. "He never said that to me," Miriam said. "No," I said. "He said it to me in January at 11 o'clock at night, because he was 82 and running out of time, and he wasn't very good at saying things directly to the people they were meant for." I paused. "He wasn't perfect, Miriam. He was thorough, and he was honest, and he built something remarkable, and he still missed things. That's just the truth." "I know," she said. "He loved you," I said. "Badly and imperfectly and with gaps in it. But it was real." She didn't say anything to that for a long moment. Then she said, "The mediation, the condition, I'm going to see it through." "I know you are," I said. Not for the money, she said, with a firmness that I believed. I mean, the money matters. I'm not going to pretend otherwise, but that's not why. She paused. I want to know if we can actually be a family again, not the family we pretended to be at Christmas dinners, a real one. I want to know if that's possible. I don't know if it is, I said honestly. Neither do I, she said, but I think it's worth finding out. June arrived and the 7th session happened, and then the 8th, and Renata began talking to George about what she was observing, again, through the careful, appropriate channel, maintaining the confidentiality of the process while fulfilling the trust documentation requirements. What she reported was not a fairy tale. She was explicit about that. What she reported was 3 people who were doing the genuinely difficult work of rebuilding something that had been deteriorating for well over a decade, and who were doing it imperfectly and inconsistently and sometimes badly, but who kept showing back up. That was the thing Harold had banked on, I think. Not that his children were good enough to be graceful about this, but that they were stubborn enough to keep showing up even when they weren't. Vanessa and Carter had started talking. Real talking. The kind that was awkward and halting and occasionally painful, and also, from what Vanessa told me in late June, occasionally astonishing. Carter had said something to her in April that she had written down and kept on her desk. I don't need you to be different all at once, Mom. I just need you to try. She told me this the way people tell you things they've been saving, carefully, like they're still not sure they deserve to say it out loud. He gave me permission, she said. A 17-year-old kid gave me permission to be imperfect and still show up. His grandfather would have liked that. Harold would have loved that, I said. Cole had restructured the firm, smaller, more focused, more honest in its projections. He had turned down the Blue Ridge Hotel project permanently, and when I asked him how that felt, he said, like putting down something I was only carrying because I was afraid of what I'd think of myself if I stopped. He and Vanessa had lunch in Richmond in May, just the 2 of them, first time in years. And by Cole's account, it was awkward for the first 40 minutes, and then suddenly, for about an hour, it wasn't. We talked about Mom, he said. Neither of us usually does. We talked about what she was like when we were young, before everything got complicated. And for a while we were just her kids. The trust's 6-month minimum threshold was approaching. George Falk was in regular contact with Renata, and Renata's documentation was building toward the assessment that the trust required. Nobody was celebrating yet. The condition specified not just the attendance, but something measurable in the dynamic between the siblings, something Renata would have to certify. I drove out to the estate one evening in late June, alone, just to sit in the house for a while. It was still Harold's, technically. The property was part of the trust, its disposition tied to the same condition. I let myself in with the spare key Harold had given me years ago, and I walked through the rooms, and I ended up in the study. I sat in his chair, just for a few minutes. The bookshelves were the same, the leather arms of the chair were worn in the same places. Outside the window, the garden was full and green, the way Patricia's garden always got in June. I thought about the envelope, cream-colored, battered at the corners. For my children. The thing they'd almost dismissed as sentiment, the thing that turned out to hold everything. Harold had known what he was doing. He had always known what he was doing, even when it looked like an old man being sentimental about a letter. What it actually was a man who had spent a lifetime being precise, being deliberate, being the kind of person who shook your hand and looked you in the eye and gave you exactly 3 seconds of his full attention, deploying every last bit of that precision in the only project he ever admitted was more important than the business. His family. The dusty envelope hadn't been a final gift. It had been a final bet. A bet placed by a man who had watched his children become strangers and still refused to believe that strangers were all they could be. The verdict on that bet wasn't in yet, but the fact that all 3 of them were still in that room with Renata Ose, still writing letters they'd never send and making phone calls that went long in unexpected directions, and sitting at lunch tables across from siblings they'd spent years avoiding, that meant something. It meant Harold Whitmore hadn't lost his bet yet. Whether he'd win it was still, as of late June, with the summer heat just beginning to settle into the Virginia hills and the garden outside, coming back the way gardens do when someone has tended them faithfully. Still an open question. But it was closer than it had ever been. The certification meeting was scheduled for the 2nd week of August, nearly 10 months after Harold's passing, 2 months past the trust's minimum 6-month threshold, which Renata had quietly recommended extending because she felt the work wasn't finished enough to hold up under its own weight yet. Nobody argued with that, which, honestly, was its own kind of progress. I drove to Charlottesville on a Sunday the week before, not because anyone had asked me to, but because I felt the pull of the place, the way you feel the pull of anything that has held a significant portion of your life for long enough. The estate was still standing in its summer fullness, the garden reaching the particular peak it hit every August. Patricia's roses coming up the way they always had, the long grass along the fence line moving in the slow heat. The house was occupied now only on weekends, when one or another of the siblings came through to tend things. It had become, in the months since Harold's death, a kind of shared responsibility that nobody had explicitly assigned and everybody had quietly accepted. That, too, was its own kind of progress. I let myself in and walked through the rooms, and I ended up where I always ended up, Harold's study, in the leather chair that still held the shape of him, if you sat in it right. I had a folder with me, copies of the documentation George had assembled, Renata's preliminary assessment notes, the trust terms. I'd been over all of it enough times that I didn't need to read it again. I just wanted to sit with it, in that room, where it had started. On the desk, in the spot where the cream envelope had sat that January evening, there was nothing, just the clean wood grain and the late afternoon light. I sat there for a long time, not thinking about anything in particular, just letting the house be quiet around me, and I thought about how strange it is, the way a person can leave a room and still be present in it. Harold had been gone for 10 months, and his study still felt inhabited. Not haunted, just held. The way some spaces hold the people who lived in them the longest. Not as ghosts, but as a kind of permanent quality of the air. I thought about the envelope. I thought about how close they had come to never opening it. How Vanessa had said, in that first moment, "It's fine, we can read it after," and George had held the line, and Harold, even from wherever Harold was, had won that particular standoff. I thought about what would have happened if George had handed it over at the end, after the distribution documents, after the siblings had already processed the numbers and begun calculating. Whether the letter would have landed the same way. Whether the condition would have felt like a door or a trap. Timing, Harold had always said, was the difference between a good deal and a great one. He had timed the letter perfectly. He had known, with the precision of a man who had spent 60 years reading rooms, exactly when his children needed to hear it. He had been, right up to the end, the smartest person in the room. The certification meeting happened on a Tuesday. George Falk's office again, the same conference room with the tall windows, the same long table. But the room felt different from October. Less charged, less braced. Or maybe I was different, after 10 months of watching 3 people dismantle and reassemble themselves in increments. Renata Osei was there in person for the first time since the process had begun. She was exactly what I had imagined from her reputation. A woman who took up a precise and deliberate amount of space and whose eyes had the quality of someone who had spent 30 years listening to what people said underneath what they were saying. She greeted each of the siblings with the warmth of someone who had been in the room for their worst moments and was still choosing to believe in them. Vanessa came in first, in a charcoal blazer that was slightly less pressed than her October version, which I noticed and appreciated. Carter was with her. Not in the meeting itself, but he had driven down from a friend's place in D.C. to be nearby, which Vanessa had mentioned to me the previous week in the tone of a woman who still wasn't sure she deserved it and was trying to. Cole came in with Sandra, same as October, but Sandra was seated at the table this time, not to the side. Cole had asked her to be present. She'd said yes with the quiet steadiness of a woman who had decided, somewhere in the past 10 months, that she was not the supporting cast of this story, and that the people who loved her should know it. Miriam came alone. She looked different from October, thinner, which worried me slightly, but also clearer somehow, the way a face looks when the thing it's been holding has been partially set down. She had been in twice-weekly therapy since February, separate from the mediation, a decision she'd made herself after the night Elliot left. She hadn't told her siblings about it at first. Then, in the 7th session, she had told them. Cole had said, without missing a beat, "That's a good idea. Good for you." Vanessa had said, "I've been in therapy for 4 years," in a tone that suggested this was either reassuring or competitive, possibly both. Miriam had laughed, a real laugh, startled out of her. And Cole had laughed too. And even Vanessa had smiled in the way she smiled when something caught her genuinely off guard. and Renata had written something in her notebook that none of them could see. I sat to the side, same position as October. George opened the meeting with the procedural framing the way he always did. Then he turned to Renata. Renata spoke for about 20 minutes. She did not summarize the sessions. She had made clear from the beginning that session content was confidential and would remain so, even in the documentation submitted to the trust. What she certified was observable behavioral and relational changes, documented through the structured benchmarks Harold had built into the trust terms. She was precise and she was honest, including about the places where the work was incomplete. This is not a family that has resolved its history, she said. I want to be clear about that because I think clarity serves you better than a comfortable conclusion. She looked at all three of them in turn. What I can certify is that over the past 8 months, these three individuals have demonstrated a measurable and documented shift in how they communicate with each other, how they handle conflict, and how they hold each other accountable. They have told each other truths that had been unspoken for decades. They have made and received apologies that were genuine and specific. They have, on multiple occasions, chosen the harder and more honest path when an easier one was available. She paused. That is what the trust required. That is what I am certifying. She set the documentation on the table and signed it. George nodded, gathered the papers, and said the words that meant the trust was released. The room was very quiet for a moment. Cole exhaled, a long, slow breath that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than his lungs. Sandra put her hand over his on the table without looking at him, the automatic gesture of a person who knows exactly when someone beside them needs to be touched. Miriam's eyes filled, but she didn't cry this time. She just sat with it, the way she had been learning to sit with things. Vanessa looked at the window. Then she looked at George, then at Renata, and then, last, at Cole and Miriam. And she said, quietly, and without any of the performance that used to accompany her composed moments, he was right. Nobody asked what she meant. They all knew. What happened afterward was not a celebration. I want to be honest about that too. There was no champagne, no group embrace, no perfectly lit moment of collective catharsis. Life is rarely that neat, and the Whitmore family had spent enough time learning the cost of preferring comfortable fictions over difficult realities that none of them reached for the comfortable version of this moment. What happened was that the meeting ended and they walked out into the August heat together, the four of them, 5, including Sandra, and they stood on the sidewalk outside George Falk's office for a few minutes, and Cole said, "Does anyone want lunch?" And Vanessa said, "Yes, actually." And Miriam said, "There's a place 2 blocks over that Dad used to like." And they walked there together. I followed a few steps behind, not quite part of the group, not quite outside of it. Carter was waiting on the sidewalk near a coffee shop, scrolling his phone, and he fell into step beside his mother without ceremony. Vanessa reached over and briefly, almost clumsily, put her arm around his shoulders for a few seconds. Carter let her. That was the whole thing. It lasted about 4 steps and then she let go and they kept walking, but I saw it. And it was the most I had seen from Vanessa in 10 months and possibly years. At lunch, they talked about Harold. Not about the estate, not about the trust, not about the money, just about him. Cole told the story about copying Vanessa's homework in 9th grade, this time directly to her face at a table, and Vanessa said, "I knew," which sent Cole into a full laugh, the real kind, the one you can't manufacture. "You knew?" he said. "Why didn't you?" And Vanessa said, "Because you were so relieved every time, and it was the only time you looked at me like I was useful rather than competition." And the table went quiet for a second, and then Miriam said, "That's the saddest and most Vanessa sentence I've ever heard." And somehow that was funny, and they laughed, all 3 of them, in the particular way of siblings who share a private language they'd temporarily forgotten they had. Carter sat at the end of the table eating his burger and watching his mother and her siblings with the quiet attention of a teenager who is understanding something about where he comes from that he hadn't understood before. I watched him watching them. After lunch, walking back to the parking lot, Miriam dropped back to walk beside me. "How do you think he'd feel?" she asked. "If he could see this." I thought about it seriously, the way the question deserved. "I think he'd feel vindicated," I said. "And I think he'd feel sad that it took this long. And I think he'd be glad the 2 things could be true at the same time without one canceling out the other." Miriam nodded. "He was good at holding 2 things at once." "He was," I said. "I've been thinking," she said, about what I want to do with my share. Not the gallery. I mean, the gallery is part of it. But I've been thinking about the Charlottesville building, the commercial property. She glanced at me. I wanted to convert part of it, a community arts space, free classes, rotating exhibitions for emerging artists who can't afford gallery fees. She paused. It was always going to be his building, in my head. I turned it into something I was owed. I think I want to turn it into something that's actually about what I care about instead. That's a good use of a building, I said. Renata called it redirecting, Miriam said, taking the energy that was going in a destructive direction and giving it somewhere real to go. She smiled slightly. I call it trying to be a person my father would recognize. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. 3 months later, in November, 1 year after Harold's passing, the siblings gathered at the estate. It wasn't planned as a commemoration, or rather, it started as an administrative meeting, a final walkthrough of the property before decisions were made about its long-term disposition, and then gradually, without anyone explicitly deciding, became something else. I was there. Louise was with me. Sandra and Carter were there. Elliot was not, though Miriam had mentioned they'd been in contact, not romantically, she was careful to note, but with the kind of honesty that comes after a relationship ends, and both people decide the honesty was the part worth keeping. They walked through the house together, all three of them, the way you walk through a space you're deciding what to do with. They moved through the rooms that had held 30 years of their history, the dining room with the long mahogany table, the kitchen where Cole and Vanessa had their late-night confrontation, the study with Harold's chair and Harold's books, and the desk where the envelope had sat. In the study, they stopped. I stood in the doorway and watched the three of them stand there together for a moment, not talking. Just standing in their father's room, in the space where he had made his final plan, surrounded by the books, and the worn leather, and the quality of the air that still, even after a year, held something of him. Vanessa said, "I want to keep the house." Cole looked at her. "What do you mean?" "I don't want to sell it," she said. "I know it makes financial sense to liquidate the property. I know that, but I don't want to sell it." She looked at the bookshelves, then at Cole, then at Miriam. "Mom planted that garden. Dad kept it for 20 years after she died. I want to keep it." Miriam said, "I want to keep it too." They both looked at Cole. Cole stood very still for a moment. He looked around the room, at the chair, at the window with the garden visible through it, at the photograph on the shelf, Harold and Patricia, and 3 children squinting into the sun at Myrtle Beach. "Sandra and I have been talking about where we want the girls to grow up," he said slowly. "About what we want them to have, not financially, just the kind of foundation." He looked at his sisters. "Dad grew up with nothing and built something because 4 people trusted him when he had nothing. I keep thinking about that. What the equivalent of that looks like for our kids." "What are you saying?" Vanessa asked. "I'm saying—" He stopped, started again. "I'm saying I want the same thing you want. I want to keep the house." He paused. "I also want to propose something, and I want you to hear me out before you respond." He had been sitting on this proposal for a month, he told us later. He had drafted it 3 times and run it by Sandra, and then Renata, who had told him it was either very wise or very premature, and that the difference depended entirely on whether his sisters were ready to hear it. He proposed that they convert the estate into a joint family property, a shared asset held under a new agreement, not the trust, but a separate structure built by all 3 of them together. A place that belonged to all of them equally, that none of them could unilaterally sell or leverage, that their children and eventually their children's children would have access to. A place the family would return to. A place that would require, structurally, that they keep talking to each other, because you cannot maintain a shared property without sustained cooperation, and Harold had understood that too, probably, when he left the house as part of the trust condition. Vanessa was quiet for a long time. "You've been working on this," she said. "For about a month," Cole said. "You should have led with it," she said, "instead of the long wind-up." "I was nervous," he said. Vanessa looked at him with an expression I hadn't seen on her face before, something that might have been fondness, if you caught it in the right light and didn't look directly at it, in case it disappeared. "You're nervous?" she said. "You? In a room with 2 people who have known you your whole life?" "Yes," Cole said simply. "Yes, I am." A beat. Miriam said, "I'm in." They both looked at Vanessa. Vanessa looked at the window, at the garden, at the last of the November light coming through the glass and making long rectangles on Harold's floor. She was quiet for a long time, long enough that I thought she was going to ask for time to have her attorneys review it, which would have been so perfectly Vanessa that I almost wanted her to do it just for the consistency. Then she said, "I want it in writing, properly structured. Nobody's operating on good faith alone. We've all learned that lesson." "Agreed," Cole said immediately. "And I want a clause that requires annual review," she said. "So no single person can sit on a decision indefinitely and use procedural delay as a strategy." "That is so specifically aimed at me," Cole said. "It is specifically aimed at you, yes," Vanessa said. "And I want it in the document." Cole said, "Fine." Vanessa said, "Fine." And then, after a second, "Yes, I'm in." Sandra made a small sound from the doorway, something close to relief, and then composed herself. Carter, leaning against the wall in the hallway, was looking at his phone with the careful blankness of a teenager pretending not to be moved by something. Louise, beside me, quietly took my hand. "I want to tell you something, and I want to be honest about it, which means I have to tell you the parts that aren't resolved along with the parts that are." The trust was released. The property agreement was drawn up. Vanessa's attorneys naturally drafted it, and Cole reviewed it with his own counsel, and Miriam read every page herself and marked it up with questions that turned out to be mostly good ones. It was signed in December, the three of them at the same long table in George Falk's conference room, the same room where it had all started 14 months earlier. George, when he filed the final documents, told me privately that in 30 years of estate law, he had seen Harold's scenario play out in every possible direction. The money going to charity. The condition never met. The siblings fighting the trust in court for years, the family dissolving entirely. He said the Whitmore outcome was not the most common one. He said that clearly, without sentiment, because he was not a sentimental man. "What made the difference?" I asked him. He thought about it seriously. "Harold," he said. "The letter. The fact that he told them the truth while he still could, and didn't just leave them a number on a piece of paper." He picked up his pen. "Most people leave the truth in the envelope until it's too late." He timed it right. That stayed with me. Because the thing about the dusty envelope, the thing I keep returning to, even now, is that it wasn't really about the money. Harold knew that when he wrote it. He wasn't using the money as a reward for good behavior, the way a parent might use dessert to get a child to eat vegetables. He was using the money to create a structure, a container, inside which the truth had room to exist. He understood that his children would not voluntarily walk into a room and do the painful, humbling work of telling each other the truth without something that made them have to. He understood human nature because he had spent a lifetime studying it, including in himself. And he understood that the truth, once it existed in that room, would do the rest. I was right. But not in the clean, triumphant way stories usually want to be right. The truth in that room caused pain before it caused anything else. It cost Vanessa something with Carter before it gave her something back. It cost Cole his comfortable self-delusion before it gave him a more honest version of himself. It cost Miriam Elliott, and that loss was real, and the wound of it was real, and I don't want to smooth over it by saying she's better off. She may be, but she also lost something she loved, and that is part of what the reckoning cost. Nobody gets the truth for free. That's the thing Harold understood that his children had to learn the hard way. That honesty is not a gift, it's a transaction. You give it, and what you get back is not guaranteed and is rarely comfortable and is almost never what you expected. What you get is the chance to stop building your life on things that aren't solid. What you get is the foundation. What you do on top of that foundation is still entirely up to you. The Whitmores got their foundation. That's what I can tell you. I visited the estate the following spring, April again, almost 18 months after Harold's death. And the garden was in full early bloom, the roses Patricia had planted coming up through whatever winter had done to them, the same way they always had. Miriam was there, working in the garden, which I had not seen before. She was wearing old clothes and she had dirt on her hands, and she looked more at ease in her body than I had seen her look in a very long time. "You garden?" I said. "I'm learning," she said. "Badly." She sat back on her heels and looked at the rose beds. I found Mom's original planting notes in the house. She documented everything. What she planted where, when, what was doing well, what kept dying. It's this whole system. She shook her head. 30 years of notes, and Dad just kept following them, all this time. I looked at the garden, at 30 years of one person's love, maintained by another person's faithfulness, still alive and coming back every spring. He never told anyone that, I said. No, Miriam said. He never told anyone. She pulled a weed with more force than necessary, then looked at it. That's the thing about him, isn't it? All this, everything he felt, everything he did, he kept so much of it to himself. Like he thought people could see it without him having to say it. She set the weed aside. And some of it we could see. And some of it we just missed. The letter helped, I said. The letter helped, she agreed. I wish it hadn't taken a letter. She paused. I wish we'd been the kind of family where he just said it, where any of us just said it. She looked up at me. I'm trying to be that now. With Vanessa and Cole, I'm trying to just say the thing, instead of waiting until there's a crisis to force it. She half smiled. I'm not very good at it yet. You'll get better, I said. Maybe, she said, or maybe this is just who we are and we'll always have to work at it. She stood up, brushed the dirt from her knees. Either way, we're working at it. Cole brought the twins to the estate in July, and they ran through the garden with the absolute anarchic joy of 12-year-olds with nowhere else to be. And Cole sat on the back porch and watched them and looked like a man who had recently discovered that watching his children exist in a place with history was something he'd been depriving himself of for years. Carter spent a weekend there in August, the week before his senior year started. He and Vanessa walked the property together on the first evening, and I know this because Vanessa told me, with the careful precision she used for things that mattered to her. He asked me about his grandmother, about what Patricia was like. I talked about her for an hour, and I couldn't stop. I didn't know I had so much to say. She paused. He listened to all of it. Of course he did, I said. He's your son. Vanessa was quiet for a moment. Then, he's a better person than I was at his age. Kids usually are, I said. That's not an accident, that's you. She didn't argue with that, which was, from Vanessa Whitmore, the equivalent of saying thank you. Harold Whitmore built a $50 million empire from 2 shirts and cold walls, and the refusal to be the man who couldn't provide. He built it with his hands and his mind and the particular grinding will of someone who knows what it feels like to have nothing and swears they will never feel it again. But the thing I keep thinking about, the thing that stays with me when I think about him, isn't the empire. It's the January phone call. The 11 o'clock Sunday night, Daniel, no, I don't think it is, and the long drive to Charlottesville and the bourbon and the firelight and the man in the chair that was slightly too large for him, telling me what he'd seen and what he was going to do about it. He could have done nothing. He was 82 years old and tired, and his children had disappointed him in ways that cut deep, and he could have signed the standard distribution documents and left them the money and let the chips fall. Nobody would have blamed him. He had earned the right to be tired. Instead, he did the hardest thing. He wrote the letter. He built the condition. He trusted, not blindly, not sentimentally, but with the clear-eyed, deliberate trust of a man who has spent his whole life betting on people, that his children were still in there somewhere, that the strangers who had been measuring his belongings at his dinner table were not the final version of the people he had raised. He was right. Not completely, not cleanly, not without cost, but right. The envelope was dusty because it had been sitting in a drawer while Harold finalized everything else, handled everything else, got everything in order with the precision he'd brought to 60 years of business. The dust wasn't neglect, it was time. It was an old man with limited time doing everything he needed to do before the one last thing he needed to say. He got it said. And his children, imperfect, complicated, greedy and grieving and capable of both betrayal and grace, heard him. That's the whole story. Or most of it. The rest is still being written in a garden in Charlottesville that blooms every spring, regardless of what winter does to it, the way things that were planted with love tend to do. Harold left them $50 million. What he actually gave them was the truth. The money was just the envelope.